So the next project up on the channel is one of these sensory tables. I'm sure if you're into woodworking or furniture in general, or you have children, you've probably seen these around. They're kind of a hot product on the market right now. The basic concept is they're a different style of play where you have these series of containers. I designed this one because these specific containers will nest inside of each other, so you can lay out the containers in a couple different ways right off the bat. And then you put sensory-based materials or objects in there for a more interactive style of play. So this is not necessarily a complicated piece of furniture to make. So I kind of geared this build towards people that are hobbyists and DIYers and want to improve their skill set a little bit.
So at this point, I'm going to switch over to some photos I sent the customer as I was building this. It's easier to see what I'm talking about looking at these close-ups. But basically, and this is not a new opinion, I hear this a lot on YouTube from people that have been woodworking for a while, and that is that the best way to get better at woodworking is not only to educate yourself, but to take on projects that are outside your realm of expertise. You will naturally make mistakes from that. You'll grow from that, you'll gain knowledge, and you could expand on your skill set. The beauty of this project and why I'm using this one for this example is, since this is built from 2x4s, mistakes will be cheaper and they won't be as expensive to replace. 2x4s are still relatively inexpensive, and because it's a sensory table, stuff like the size of tenons and structural integrity isn't as important as if you're making a table. So like I said, I'm making this out of 2x4s. I prefer the nicer grade Douglas fir 2x4. It takes stain a little bit nicer. It clear coats a little bit nicer than white wood. I just enjoy working with it better. I use dimensional lumber in my work, but when I do use it, it's for specific purposes. And my opinion, the way that it looks best is if it's not left in 2x4 form. So the first thing I did, and I was building this as I went, so I will have plans for this project after the second video, and you might notice the plans are a little bit different than this because I kind of went through and chopped this up into pieces I thought I would use, and I had more sizes of lumber of certain sizes than I needed. But basically, like I said, I went through and I cut this up into my main parts, which are going to be my legs and my aprons and my stretchers. So I was ripping these down. I have sizes for this throughout the video. You won't need to buy the plans in order to build this, but you might have to pause the video to get measurements. And you could see this was basically just a process of ripping stuff down. Once I got it to width, once again, I think 2x4s look best in furniture when they're not the original sizes they came in. So I ripped these down to size, and then I took about a ½ inch off. So I was working with about an inch wide material. It just makes it look more so like a hardwood. It makes it look more streamlined. It takes the chunkiness out of the look of furniture that was built with 2x4s, in my opinion. Now, if you want to keep 2x4s, you want to skip this step, you can modify the plans and build straight from 2x4s. I'm not knocking anyone that does that. I just think furniture looks better when it's sized properly. So that is basically what this was. This is my stack that I'm left with. So I had a couple different sizes. These ones that look more so like a square, you can see I'm putting the dimensions on them right now, are going to be the legs, and I cut too much of that. These flatter ones, which are more so a size of a 1x3, are going to be the aprons and the stretchers. And then these leftover bits, I thought at the time I would use them for something, and I do end up using them for something, but you saw the dimensions there were 1.5 by 3/4. So these are the containers I'm using, and like I said, I was happy to find these because they nest together. So these two smaller containers fit in these larger ones. If you buy different containers, I cannot guarantee that the plans will work for what you're doing. But you can see they fit together, so you could automatically make a couple different designs. You could drill holes in the bottoms of some of these. You could stack them as much as you want, so it was really conducive to the project. I will try and find the links for these and put them in the description. Obviously, you can see I got these from Lowe's. And I also like the fact that they had lids that came with them, so everything can be sealed up. You don't have to worry about necessarily cleaning everything up so it won't get wet. So these are going to be the dimensions I'm working with. I'm going to start with the legs, and I'm going to be putting mortises in the legs and tenons on the aprons. So those were the rough sizes I'm starting with. I just cut my boards down to size. Mortise and tenons and lap joints are probably the two joints I use the most in the shop. Mortise and tenon are going to be for joining anything with legs. They're going to be one of the strongest joints you can make. And once you get good at making them, they're not super difficult to make. So all of the dimensions are based off of these containers. I like to lay everything out and really visualize how the build's going to go. So I came up the right amount from the bottom to give me a nice look, but also clearance for the two containers to set. And then I marked centers and I could make my mortises. Now obviously I'm using a mortising machine because I have that, did not always have this machine. So for the beginning of this video, I'm obviously going to be using this machine because this was a customer project, so time was of the essence. But in the second video, I will show you how I used to cut these, and that was with a hand drill. Now, that's kind of the range of skill set for this. You can cut them with a hand drill. You can cut them up to a mortising machine. I've made jigs for these. It's a very versatile joint. Obviously, the machine is going to be the most accurate. But if you're watching this and you already feel overwhelmed because I'm using a somewhat expensive tool, in the second part of this video, I will show you how to avoid having to buy that expensive tool. The nice thing about this, as you can see, is it sets the depth automatically for me, as well as there's a fence which will set this to center, so I could set it up once and cut all of my mortises. Now, like I said in the intro, the nice thing about this is when I'm making a table and torsion strength as well as weight strength are really important aspects of the build. For something like this that's so small and that will most likely only last a few years, not the furniture, but the necessity of it will only last a few years before you're getting rid of it because the child will outgrow it. It's not as important you size your tenons and your mortises as you would a full-size table. So there is some leeway with this, which is nice. You can kind of get your feet wet with trying out newer joints without having to worry about all the math involved behind more accurate joints. So as you can see, I cut all of my original mortises, and like I said, I'm going through this pretty quickly because at certain points throughout this, like right now, I show you all my sizes, so you could pause this if you want accurate sizes without buying the plans, and I could go through and cut my aprons. Now in furniture making, the top side of these are called aprons. They join the top of the legs to the other top of a leg, most commonly used on tables. A lot of people, myself included, anything that joins the bottom portion of a leg to another bottom portion of a leg is called a stretcher. So that's kind of the terminology I use. I'm sure someone will correct me if that is wrong, but that's what I use. And I use the radial arm saw to make my tenons. I always do a test joint. I cut my mortises first and do a test joint, make sure everything fits before going through and cutting all my tenons. Now the other thing about this material is because it's a 2x4 and I ripped it very quickly on the table saw, the dimensions are going to be a little off, a little wonky. Once again, this project is perfect because if this piece is a little unsquare, things don't line up perfectly, your tenons are a little thinner or thicker than your mortises, this is the sort of project where you can get away with those little mistakes and fine-tune them for nicer pieces of furniture. So that is my tenon. You can see it's sized for 3/8 of an inch because that is the bit I have in my mortiser. And then I have a stop on my radial arm saw, and I could just cut the ends of these tenons. This is pretty simple. I use a similar process when I'm making lap joints, and the nice thing about being able to do this on a separate saw is it frees up the table saw. If you do not have a radial arm saw, once again, you can cut these with a router. I actually have made jigs for cutting tenons specifically with routers. You can also cut these on the table saw. So you don't need a lot of fancy tools, and at some point there is an assumption here in woodworking that you will have some tools. I know some people think that you can build stuff with very very small amount of tools, and you can, but at some point, if you want to get better at this, you are going to have to invest in some tools. And then, like I said, I'm going through that pretty slowly and then speeding it up. I'm just going down the equal distance on both sides so that I am left with a 3/8 inch tenon. I have a stop, so I'm getting my exact depth of my tenon. It's a very quick process once you set this up, flip it over, and I can do that really quickly on both sides. So that my tenon's not so big, I like to add a shoulder, usually in most circumstances, to the top and the bottom. So I just clean up those curve cuts with a chisel, and then I can bring this back to my piece. You'll see this throughout. I know some people do a lot of this stuff with math. They make accurate drawings, cut all their pieces, then put it together. I like to build as I go. I like to visualize things. I like to make marks off of marks already on my lumber. So I brought this over to the mortise, marked where it was on my piece, and then I could cut off my shoulders. That also means that these joints are somewhat unique, so I like to label them as I go as well, so everything lines up again perfectly. I could use a straight edge to extend those initial marks, and then for this, once again, you could do this with multiple tools, but I've gotten pretty good at cutting somewhat straight lines with the handsaw, so I just use a handsaw to follow my marks and cut off those shoulders. You see I could go straight through, flip it over to the side, and then cut that. I'll be left with that central tenon, and then obviously, and I know I've said this before, you can see, so this is a 2x4, if you mess these up and you want to start again, messing up something like this is probably about 50 cents worth of material. Messing up something like this out of even a cheaper lumber like oak is going to be much more expensive. And then I just do this with all of my boards. I go through, I fit them. Sometimes the mortises need a little bit of material removed. Sometimes the tenons need a little bit of material removed, but I just get all of them to fit, and I'll label them as I go so I can reference those pieces back into the right marks, because like I said, there usually is some fine tuning involved, but pretty simple stuff. It's rinse and repeat. If you can drill one mortise, you can drill all 8 of them on these legs. If you can make the tenons, especially because that's set up with jigs, it's pretty simple stuff. A lot of this is just getting all of the sizes accurate, making sure that your lengths are proper, accounting for the fact that material goes into the mortise and remembering to add that to your dimensions. All that stuff is the stuff where you'll start making mistakes at first and then fine tune it. So that is going to be one side of my piece, and obviously there's going to be 2 of these. I made both of these long sides at the same time, and then once those are together, you can see what I meant by labeling them. I could pop all these apart. Now I'm going to be putting mortises on the inside. All I did for this was mark them just as a reference. Once you pop all these things apart, you might think you know where the marks are going to be, but sometimes your pieces get flipped over and mistaked, and these aren't full squares, so it's easy to put these on the wrong side because they look like they're the same dimension, but they're really not. So like I said, all I did was make a mark where that should be. I could set up my fence for my mortising machine and cut all of these. It's pretty simple stuff. I just find center, I mark that on there. I come out 3/16 of an inch from either side so that my mortise is centered. The 3/16 and 3/16 will equal 3/8, and then I could take it to the mortising machine, move my fence, set up my depth stop, because since this side's thinner, my my mortise isn't going to be as deep. They will meet in the middle. For this, there will be a little bit of a gap for the style of this, but once again, that will not matter on something like this. I just built a table where that did matter, and I put miters on my tenons in order to join them. But for something like this, the simplicity makes it so that you don't have to worry about stuff like that. You saw I set up my fence, I set up my depth, and then I could just go through, make sure I'm in between all of my marks, and cut the other 8 mortises on this side. Now you can see my stop does not go all the way down, so we just have a little shim, which is a piece of wood that's holding this material underneath that top side fence. So that is my first set on one leg, and from this you can see how those will join together. And then I could just go through, mark all of my other pieces, and cut those as well. Something like this in my shop I built this whole frame in an afternoon pretty quickly because I've made quite a few of these. For someone who's just starting out, I don't think this is an absurd project to say that you can get it done in a weekend. So then once I had those two sides together, I can measure for my width. I want this to be fairly tight because I don't want to have to put any supports underneath. So you could see I measured my opening. I added the width of my tenon, which is a 1/2 inch, and then I get my final measurement for my sides. So then it's going to be the exact same thing. I have a bunch of this apron stretcher material because I ripped it all down that first go around. And then for this one, because my tenon's not as thick, you can see all I'm going to do is slide my fence over, align my marks with my blade, tighten that fence, which is basically just a 2x4 clamp to the saw, and then the depth is going to be the exact same, and I could go through and cut all these new tenons. It's going to be the exact same process as making those first sides, so I'm running through this pretty quickly. You get down to that material, mark for the shoulders, and cut them. So pretty simple stuff. I know I've made a bunch of these, so it looks very simple, but once you get a hang of it, it's very quick, and it's so much stronger than some of the other joints I see on the internet, especially butt joints. Once you put glue in these joints, it's going to become even stronger. So like I said, I sized it. I could cut my shoulders. Those are all of my pieces. You can see how it fit between the frame with the extensions for the tenons, and I could dry fit all of this together. I also enjoy making furniture that holds itself together. It's not always going to happen in every circumstance, but something like this, you could take this apart, make modifications, put it back together. It squares itself up pretty easily because of the way it's oriented, so you don't really have to worry about things being too off square. Obviously you still have to tweak things, but just the way that it's designed, you can see it's already holding itself together. There's no glue or hardware in this at this point. Can make sure my top fits, and that is basically where I'm going to leave off with this video. This will be a 2-part series, and like I said, I'll have plans out next week because I use these YouTube links in the plans, and I obviously don't have the second link at this point.